Two farm boys are born in the same dirt-poor stretch of the Midwest, in the same handful of years, same soil under their fingernails, same nothing waiting for them. One of them will grow up to rob more banks than any man in American history. The other will be the one who kills him. Today, one of those names is famous in every country on earth. The other name, you have never heard. That second man is you, and this is your entire life. 1908. You're 6 years old, sitting in a dust yard with a stick carved into the shape of a rifle. A few farms over, some years apart, same flat horizon. Another boy holds his own wooden gun. Neither of you owns a real one yet. Neither of you knows the other exists. You both want the same thing every poor farm kid in the depression-bound Midwest wants: to be somebody. He'll get there by taking what isn't his. You'll get there by chasing him. Right now, you're just two boys pointing sticks at nothing. 1929. You're 21, one semester from a law degree, and the entire economy falls out from under the country in a single autumn. The law firms that promised you interviews stop answering letters. You spend a winter reading rejection slips at your mother's kitchen table. Then you see a notice pinned in a post office. The federal government is hiring. Steady wage, steady work. You don't take the job because you believe in justice. You take it because you're hungry. Your first day at the bureau, a supervisor walks the new hires down a row of desks. No guns on any hip in the room. You're accountants, he says. You're lawyers. You chase paper, bank fraud, stolen bonds. You have no authority to make an arrest and no permission to carry a weapon. They call you agents. You are, in fact, unarmed clerks with badges, and every gangster in the Midwest already knows it. The movies will invent the gun-toting G-man a few years from now. Right now, the real one can't legally touch a pistol. The Depression turns bank robbers into folk heroes. Banks foreclosed on half the farms in the Midwest. So when a man in a stolen car empties a bank vault at gunpoint, plenty of newspapers print him as Robin Hood, not a criminal. One of those men has already escaped one jail using a pistol he carved out of wood and blackened with shoe polish. The public loves the story. You file the paperwork on the aftermath. June 17, 1933. Kansas City Union Station. Gunmen open fire in broad daylight, trying to free a prisoner in federal custody. When the smoke clears, 4 lawmen are dead, cut down by machine guns they had no way to answer, because the men guarding that prisoner were still unarmed government clerks in suits. The headline the next morning doesn't call it a tragedy, it calls it what it is. Proof that the Bureau sent men to a gunfight carrying briefcases. You read it standing up. Nobody in the office says a word for a long time. Congress finally asked the question that should have been asked years earlier. How are federal agents dying with no gun and no authority to fight back? Within months, the law changes. Agents can carry a weapon. Agents can make an arrest. Your supervisor slides a service revolver across the desk. It's heavier than you expected. War on crime is declared, he tells you. Dillinger's in Chicago. You're going. For 5 years, you'd been a prop with a badge. As of this morning, you're a weapon. You're reassigned to Chicago, to a unit built for one purpose: catch John Dillinger. Special Agent Melvin Purvis runs the room. A map of the Midwest covers one wall, red pins tracking every sighting, every rumor, every dead end. He slipped every jail, every roadblock, every state line, Purvis tells the room. That ends with us. You believe him. You have no idea yet how long this is going to take or what it's going to cost. April 22nd, 1934. A tip puts Dillinger's gang at a lodge in the Wisconsin woods called Little Bohemia. You and a handful of agents surround the building in the dark and the cold. Purvis gives the signal to move. Then everything goes wrong at once. A car pulls out of the lodge's driveway. Agents open fire on it, certain it's the gang making a break. It isn't. 3 innocent CCC workers are inside. One of them, Eugene Boisno, is killed instantly. The real gang is already slipping out the back into the tree line, into the dark. That same night, fleeing the scene, Dillinger's gunman Babyface Nelson runs into a group of agents on a nearby road and kills one of them, W. Carter Baum, before vanishing into the dark. By morning, you've lost the gang, lost a fellow agent, and killed a bystander who had nothing to do with any of it. The newspapers don't call it a near miss, they call it a disaster. FBI fiasco, one headline reads. Hoover's men bungle simple ambush, reads another. You had him, then you didn't. Now the whole country is laughing. For 3 months after Little Bohemia, the trail goes dead. Sightings pour in from a dozen states and every single one is wrong. You sit at a desk staring at the same photograph so long you'd recognize this man's face in your sleep. You just can't find the rest of him. The newspapers move on to the next scandal. You don't get to. This is what a manhunt actually looks like. Not gunfire mostly. Just months of nothing. Then in July, the trail breaks. Not from police work, but from desperation. A brothel madam named Anna Sage, facing deportation, comes to Purvis with an offer. Help her stay in the country, and she'll deliver Dillinger herself. She knows exactly where he'll be tomorrow night. History will remember her as the woman in red. Her dress that night was actually orange. It only looked red under the theater lights. The legend gets the color wrong. It gets the ending right. July 22nd, 1934. You and a dozen agents surround the Biograph Theater on a warm Chicago night, mixed in with a crowd of moviegoers who have no idea what's about to happen 20 feet from them. At 10:30, Dillinger walks out of the theater, and for the first time in 3 months of chasing a photograph, you see him as an actual man. Not a legend, not a headline. A man in a straw hat, walking toward an alley, glancing sideways like he already senses something wrong. Purvis lights a cigar. That's the signal. He's here. It's real. Shots fire in the alley. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Dillinger staggers, falls, and doesn't get back up. You lower your weapon. 6 years of unarmed clerks, dead colleagues, a bystander's funeral, and a nationwide manhunt. All of it ends on a sidewalk in under the time it takes to read this sentence aloud. You didn't do it for the newspapers. You did it for the men who didn't live to see this moment. By morning, the story already belongs to someone else. The front page reads, Hoover's G-men eliminate Dillinger, over a photograph of J. Edgar Hoover, smiling for the cameras he was nowhere near the night before. Purvis, who ran the entire operation, isn't named. You aren't named. Hoover goes on the radio and calls it a triumph of federal law enforcement, without once saying the name of a single agent who was standing in that alley. Purvis will be pushed out of the bureau within a year. Hoover doesn't forgive being outshined by his own men. You just go back to work. The war doesn't end with Dillinger. Pretty boy Floyd is shot dead that October. Babyface Nelson goes down in a roadside gun battle that November, but not before he kills 2 more of your fellow agents, Samuel Cowley and Herman Hollis, in his last few minutes alive. In 1935, the Bureau gets a new name, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover builds an entire mythology around the initials, movies, comic strips, radio dramas, all of it G-Man this and G-Man that. You were there for the actual gunfights. The myth doesn't mention you either. The rest of your career is quiet by comparison, and quiet is its own kind of erasure. Counterintelligence work through the Second World War you're still not allowed to discuss decades later. Routine cases. A promotion nobody throws a party for. You retire sometime in the 1950s or 60s with a government pension and a service record that reads, on paper, like nothing much happened. Nobody at your retirement dinner mentions Little Bohemia. Nobody mentions the Biograph. You don't bring it up either. Decades later, you're an old man in your own living room, and a movie about Dillinger comes on the television. The actor playing the agent who fires the fatal shot is younger, taller, and better looking than you ever were. The audience in the theater scene applauds when Dillinger falls. Your wife brings you coffee. Neither Purvis's name nor yours appears anywhere in the credits. 2 farm boys were born a few years apart, in the same dirt-poor stretch of the Midwest, wanting the same thing. One of them chose to take what wasn't his, and his name is known on every continent. The other chose to stand in an alley and end it, and history never bothered to learn his name. You turn off the television, and this was your entire life.